everyone. Welcome. Please turn your attention to the interpretation team, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. We congratulate the organizers of this event for their firm commitment to facilitating bilingual communication in today's meeting. My name is Mojde, and my co-interpreter is Ada, and we represent the Tilde Language Justice Cooperative. We'll be providing English-Spanish and Spanish-English simultaneous interpretation. Buenas tardes a todos. Felicitamos a los organizadores de este evento por su firme determinación de facilitar la comunicación bilingüe en la reunión de hoy. Mi nombre es Mojde, mi cointérprete es Ada, y estamos representando a la Cooperativa de Justicia del Lenguaje Tilde. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea inglés-español, español-inglés. If you joined on your phone, please make sure to join on the Zoom app so that you can access interpretation. Please note that this function is not available on Chromebook. Si usted se unió a la reunión con su teléfono, por favor, asegúrese de entrar con el app de Zoom para poder acceder a la función de interpretación. Esta función no está disponible en los Chromebook. If you want to listen and participate in English, please select your language channel. Go to the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Click on the globe if you're using a computer, or the three dots if you're connected by phone. Select Interpretation, click English, click Done at the end. Si usted quiere escuchar y participar en español, por favor seleccione su canal de idioma haciendo clic abajo a la derecha de su pantalla de Zoom. En el globito si usa una computadora o en los tres puntitos si está conectada por teléfono. Seleccione Interpretación, luego Español y luego picarle en Done o Listo. A few guidelines, algunas pautas. As you can see, I'm trying to speak slowly because in addition to Spanish interpretation, we also have ASL. So please don't speak fast. This happens especially when reading a presentation or excited, nervous, or running out of time. If you're not speaking, please mute yourself. Yo estoy hablando rápido porque estoy dando la introducción en ambos idiomas, pero por favor ustedes no hablen muy rápido. Eso pasa especialmente cuando uno está leyendo una presentación o emocionada, nerviosa o al tener poco tiempo. También si no están hablando, por favor pongan su audio en silencio. Lastly, we remind you to please speak one person at a time with one language per sentence and only speak in the language of the channel you chose. If you are bilingual Spanish-English, you don't need to choose a channel, and you can speak in either of those two languages. Por último, les vamos a recordar que por favor hablen una persona a la vez en un idioma por oración y solo hablen en el idioma del canal que escogieron. Si usted es bilingüe español-inglés, no necesita escoger un canal. We create these spaces with everyone's support, so please communicate any issues by chat or turning on your volume. Thank you. Estos espacios se crean con el apoyo de todos. Por favor, comunique cualquier problema por la ventana de chat o habilitando su micrófono. Gracias. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good day, everybody. My name is Marlena Moore. I am a program specialist here at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I am a Black 30-something-year-old individual with curly hair and a head wrap and wearing black and white clothes. My pronouns are they and them, and our guests today are going to introduce themselves in the same manner. As it stands, I'd like to review some brief housekeeping notes with you. So as mentioned earlier, we are committed to making this an equitable space in which people of all abilities can participate fully and in their preferred language. This takes everyone's commitment and effort to make a reality. For example, we have limited use of the chat function. It's difficult to translate the chat in real time and can be inaccessible to assistive devices. Please send all questions, comments, or resources directly to the event hosts and co-hosts. We'll read the questions or comments aloud so they can be interpreted. While we aim to make this a mixed ability and multilingual space, we also know we're still learning how to do this well. Please reach out to event staff during the webinar if you are experiencing any accessibility issues. We'll also ask about accessibility in our post-webinar evaluation. Please let us know if your experience, or please let us know about your experience and ways we can improve. We know we have much to learn and we want to improve our practices. Also of note that this event features live captioning. You can access this feature by clicking caption at the bottom of your screen. We are also recording the event and we'll share it through our website and YouTube channel. This Q&A feature provides an opportunity for attendees to enter questions for the presenters to respond to. This should also be accessible at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please reach out to our staff if you are experiencing ongoing technical issues, but please note we may have limited capacity to resolve issues while the webinar is running. And with those notes, I will turn it over to Casey.
Thank you so much, Marlena, for opening this space for us, and hello to everybody. My name is Casey Keene. I am a white, middle-aged woman with medium-length wavy brown hair and glasses, wearing an orange top with a blue and white floral pattern. As the Director of Programs and Prevention here at NRCDV, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this workshop, What Will History Say About You and Your Organization? If this is the first time you're joining one of NRCDV's Training Institute webinars, we would like to welcome you and suggest that you visit our website and follow us on social media to learn about all of our exciting projects and initiatives. NRCDV is a national technical assistance provider working to strengthen the capacity of programs responding to survivors of domestic violence and their families by promoting effective public policy, institutional response and research, and engagement in prevention. Through our key initiatives and special projects, we work with many other organizations and partners who bring various expertise, backgrounds, perspectives, and lived experience to improve the community response to domestic violence and ultimately prevent its occurrence. At NRCDV, we know that policy and systems advocacy is essential in addressing and preventing domestic violence and intersecting issues. We commit to being expansive in our policy thinking, efforts, and focus on anti-violence work within the larger context of social justice and progressive world building. We commit to co-creating policy solutions with survivors and communities most impacted by gender-based violence and sexual violence, and to address the root causes. We commit to advance policy solutions that will make meaningful change for Black and Brown communities, trans and non-binary survivors, survivors with disabilities, immigrant survivors, and those most traumatized and harmed by carceral systems and responses. Today's workshop is a follow-up conversation from our National Prevention Town Hall in September of 2022, Prevention is Radical. At this convening of change makers in the Pacific Coast region of the United States, Valeriana Chakotay Bandua and Darren J. Dorsey presented the opening session entitled Understanding and Interrupting Anti-Blackness and White Supremacy in Our Movement. It was clear that participants were eager to go deeper into how anti-Black racism shows up in the movement and how movement workers and organizations can interrupt it. Today, we have an opportunity to explore what it means to build equitable and accountable organizations and institutions towards dismantling anti-Blackness in our work. With that, I have the great honor of introducing our amazing presenters today. Valeriana Chakotay Bandua, she, her, is a former refugee from the country of Angola. She is indigenous to the Ovimbundu tribe in the southern region of the Republic of Angola. Born in the neighboring country of Zambia due to a bitter civil war, at the age of 3, Valeriana's family fled the country of Zambia and found refuge in the country of Papua New Guinea, where she was subsequently raised. In 2007, she moved to the USA. Valeriana has served as a human rights diplomat for the country of Angola, and she is a TEDx speaker of the talk entitled Protect the Girl Child. Valeriana is an abolitionist at heart, having served in a variety of leadership roles to interrupt anti-Blackness and sexual violence in Black, immigrant, and refugee communities for over 15 years. As the founder of Necessary Interruptions, LLC, Valeriana is on an active quest to center radical racial equity practices for businesses, agencies, and organizations through a Black liberation-led lens, while championing human rights from an anti-oppressive lens that fosters safe spaces for Black communities to thrive despite the constant threat of systematic racial violence. Valeriana is also the executive director of the Social Justice Fund Northwest in Seattle, Washington, a wife to Ray, and a mother to Zaya, who is 8 months old. Welcome, Valeriana. I'd also like to introduce Darren J. Dorsey, he, him. He is the principal and co-founder of Rooting Movements, a consulting firm that helps organizations ensure that the values that underlie the change they intend to make in society are reflected in how they operate. Rooting Movements provides workshops on the topics of racial equity, movement building, and intersectional approaches to gender-based violence prevention. They also help organizations assess their practices, policies, and culture to ensure that their values are reflected in not only the work they put out, but how they do it too. Darren has learned from experience that the biggest barriers to changing our communities for the better occur when inequities happen in our organizations. And he's made it his mission to remove those barriers. Darren works in community with the amazing advocates and activists he has had the privilege to connect with over the years. He believes consultation and training work is more effective when done in collaboration with other movement workers. Welcome, Darren. And the space is yours.
Thank you so much, Casey, for having us. We just want to welcome folks far and wide for joining us for today's very, very riveting discussion presentation workshop. All right, Darren, are you ready to get started?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started with some introductions. Just giving a quick visual description. Again, my name is Darren Dorsey. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a Black man with a beard and a mustache. I'm wearing green, thick rimmed glasses, and I have dreadlocks that go down to about my ears. And I'm wearing a maroon colored t-shirt. In my background, there's a baobab tree and then a Rooting Movements logo.
Thank you, Darren. And just for me to reintroduce myself, my name is Valeriana Chikoti Bandwa Estes. My pronouns are she and her. I am a dark-skinned Black woman who has braids on with orange and clear beads. At the end of my braids, I am wearing an orange top because I'm hoping that the sun will come out today. And I'm really happy to be here with y'all.
Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited to have this conversation and really encourage folks to check out the recording of the prevention town hall that this follows up on, as that has some really great information. For today's workshop today's workshop is titled what will history say about you and your organization? And our goal is to situate our work in the context of history, and specifically our work to approach gender-based violence in a way that accounts for racial equity and other forms of oppression and the intersections that lie within. And so what we'll be doing is, after we do a land acknowledgement, human rights acknowledgement, and sort of lay the groundwork, we'll be going through some history of this movement and talking about the ways in which the values that underlie that history can be applied today to create a more equitable and inclusive movement. We'll be talking about how anti-Blackness shows up in organizations, what those impacts look like, and some things that organizations can keep in mind or steps that they can take to interrupt it and ensure that that this movement is inclusive of the leadership and input of Black survivors, Black workers, and Black communities.
And our hope today for folks who might be hearing about our work for the first time, and particularly for the content that we share, we ask everyone to please lean into the discomfort. If you're challenged by specific material, that is a good sign that you are approaching this from a perspective that is really thinking about the trajectory and the sustainability of this movement. Our goal as facilitators is to bring that information in this space, historical pieces, current pieces, and discussions that are currently also happening within the movement.
Great, so we want to start with the land acknowledgement. And for this, I'll encourage folks to one, remind yourselves of the Native peoples that once tended to and continue to tend to the land that you're on. If you don't know those Indigenous communities, then I always recommend folks to go to native-land.ca. I believe you can just put your zip code in and you can find that information. What we also want to encourage folks to think about is our relationship to the land and the way that through systems of oppression, we are encouraged to take on an exploitative relationship to the land. And that's reflected in, the items that it takes for us to be here today, to be here with each other. We're using computers, phones, laptops that have minerals from lands far away that often require, or that folks utilize exploitation to mine and to create this reality. And so I think it's important for us to be conscious of that, be conscious of that exploitation, but also to be conscious of the fact that it takes so much collaboration and community for us to be here. And that includes a lot of folks who aren't here today, who have set up this equipment, who have set up and built the furniture that we're using, et cetera. And just want to acknowledge that. I want to encourage folks to think about how, various ways that we can move away from that exploitative relationship with our land and move towards a more reciprocal relationship, whether that be by significant actions or day-to-day actions, such as tending to a garden or using alternative transportation. And with that, I'll pass it over to Valeriana for the human rights acknowledgement.
Thank you, Darren. And as history records, or it's been recorded in history, that in 1619, it is said that the first African kings, queens, poets, writers, dancers, healers, interpreters were forcibly taken from the continent of Africa and brought to the Americas and different parts of the world. We know that period of time being called into the enslavement of Black folks. I want to acknowledge that as an African immigrant on this land that was obtained through exploitative means, that is important that as much as we honor our land, we also think about those who were forcibly brought here. And thus also speaking to how we need to also interrupt the anti-Blackness that these United States have always had, specifically as it pertains to the treatment of Black people everywhere.
So, go ahead.
So for our community guidelines, folks, typically when we present, it's just important for us to just name specific things here. And for folks to really be mindful that we will be centering Black culture, Black experiences, Black content, Black history, and particularly Black liberation throughout this entire training. Go ahead, Darren.
And we encourage folks to take breaks and take care of yourselves as needed. Some of the material that we will be going over can be triggering. Again, also encouraging folks to keep your mic muted as we go through this workshop. And also want to remind folks of what Valeriana mentioned just a few minutes ago, to very much lean into that discomfort, because that often tells us that we're learning things, that we're growing.
And the last piece that we just also want to name is it's just mindful that even when you are hearing, learning, or leaning into new content, please be mindful of respecting everybody, because not all of us have the exact same lived experiences due to inequality, due to capitalism and anti-Blackness that still exists in our global community.
So before we jump into a lot of the content today, we wanted to introduce ourselves. And we'll go through this relatively quickly because I think a lot of folks here today have been in some of our workshops and have learned a little bit about us. But it's really common for folks to do workshops and to potentially have a slide on their PowerPoint that talks about their work history, their experience, their accolades, etc. And we think it's really important that we also acknowledge our history, our ancestors, and our lived experience that brings us to where we are today. And so on your screen are a number of pictures of myself and my family. At the top left, the leftmost person in the top left is my mother in a picture with a few of my aunties. And I love this picture because it just shows the sort of matriarchal nature of my family, again, which I think in many ways is what brings me here today. Below them is my great-grandmother, Annetta Chin. Annetta Chin lived in Jackson, Mississippi. She passed away in 2010 at the age of, I want to say it was either 95 or 96 years old. And so she lived through a lot. And she was, in many ways, one of the unnamed leaders of the civil rights movement. And when civil rights activists would visit Jackson, Mississippi, she would take care of their children, including Martin Luther King Jr.'s children, including Medgar Evers' children. And so she played that pivotal role and was also engaged in voter registration at a time where she could have been killed for doing that. We only found this information out within the last decade or two because when she communicated with my grandmother through letters, she often could not communicate this information for fear for her safety. And I want to acknowledge her because I believe that, again, she is one of the reasons that I'm here today. Beyond that, there's various other members of my family here, including my grandfather in the middle, my grandmother at the bottom right, my father tying my tie in the right middle picture, and my wife at the top middle picture on our wedding day. On the top right is myself and my son Titus, who's about 2.5 years old now. And soon there will be a new picture joining this, as my partner is currently pregnant, as we expect our daughter coming this October. And with that, I'll pass it over to Valeriana.
Congratulations again, Darren. And so my origin story is similar to actually what Casey had shared early in the introduction. Unbeknownst to me, I was born at a time during a civil war. And as many folks often see when they see me, they just see myself. But I often think of the ancestors that came way before my time. And in the picture on your screen and the far left side of it are both my grandparents on both sides of my family. They lived at a time when they were interrupting white supremacy, in particular because Angola was colonized by the Portuguese for over 500 years, the longest period of colonization that's been recorded on the continent of Africa. And during the era in which they lived was very similar to a Jim Crow era, where they were not allowed to be educated, not allowed to really read, not allowed to drive vehicles. My grandfather on my father's side, which who's in the top picture right on the left side of the screen, basically put it upon himself to read. He learned specifically from missionaries how to read, and he at the time was actually a doctor. And he was put on a specific hit list, and he had to seek refuge outside of the country almost immediately. My parents, when they had described that period of time in which my grandparents lived, on my father's side, they had to flee on foot. And that was a 90-day journey that they took until they reached the Zambian border. I would be later born in Zambia. And on my mother's side of the family, they fled on a train early hours of the morning. And as my mom describes it, she recalls her mother dressing her siblings in her clothes. She would later find out that the reason why my grandmother, who was a domestic worker, who came up with this idea to do that, was she was trying to ensure that her sons would not be recruited as child soldiers into the war. And so in the middle picture, my parents later met in Zambia. And by the time I was 3 years old, I moved to Papua New Guinea because the war was spilling over into the country where we had initially sought refuge. When I moved to the United States, unbeknownst to me, I had this notion or idea that I would just get my education and go back to my country of origin. But as life would have it, Tacoma, Washington has become basically my second home. And my partner, who more recently did do a DNA test, found out that his Black ancestry in particular, a large majority of his ancestry comes from the northern part of Angola. So that's very much a full circle. And the picture that you see below my partner and I is Zaya, my 9-month-old daughter. She's actually just now turning 9 months. And her middle name is named after my grandmother, who was a domestic worker. I often think of all the folks that came before my time, the folks that were actively fighting white supremacy, actively trying to operate through a Black liberatory lens before it even became a buzzword. And if it wasn't for every single one of them, I know I would not be here. I would not be able to share from a really rich experience of folks who were freedom fighters at a time when society had almost forgotten them.
Thank you, Valeriana. So we want to start by contextualizing movement history when it comes to the movement to end gender-based violence and highlight the contributions of Black folks from the very beginning. And one, I will encourage folks to continue to explore this history and to recognize this as a primer that hopefully primes you to continue to explore this and continue to understand the historical roots of the movement to end gender-based violence. There's a couple of situations that I will highlight that I think are helpful for understanding the role of Black communities and Black individuals in interrupting gender-based violence. On the bottom right of your screen is a drawing that it depicts the Memphis riots, which occurred in 1866. And the Memphis riots happened in Memphis at a time where Black folks were beginning to see some level of freedom from enslavement. And so what ended up happening is that a lot of Black folks lived in Memphis as free people during this time, and were active in the Civil War. And during this time, a conflict occurred where Black folks were actually having a celebration in Memphis. And some folks, particularly some white folks, including some sheriffs from out of town, didn't appreciate that. And so they came and tried to essentially put these Black folks in line and assert their dominance over this Black community. And this Black community resisted, and these white folks ended up leaving and gathering up other white people and communities to come to Memphis to burn the community down, to commit violence, including murder, including sexual violence against Black people in Memphis. This is a brief sort of retelling of that. And again, I encourage folks to dive into it more. But I think the piece that's really important about the Memphis riots, or one of the pieces that's really important, is that as a result of this happening, and as the United States was fighting the Confederacy, this was actually seen as the case for freeing enslaved people and for the understanding the violence that was happening systematically to enslaved people. And so several, I believe 3, perhaps 4, I can't remember the exact number, of Black women who experienced sexual violence during the Memphis riots told their stories. And they eventually made their way to the US Senate to, on the record, talk about the violence that they experienced, the anti-Black gender-based violence that they experienced. And I encourage folks to think about this, because I think it's easy for us to think about, when have folks gone to the US Senate and resisted gender-based violence in our recent memory. One example is Anita Hill going to the US Senate to name the perpetrator, Clarence Thomas. And that was a moment of history and a part of our movement that contributes to our efforts to interrupt gender-based violence. Another example is, speaking of Supreme Court justices, is Christine Blasey Ford, who went to the US Senate and told her story of experiencing sexual violence from Brett Kavanaugh. And so it's important to recognize that the folks who did this after the Memphis riots, who went to the Senate and testified on their experiences, created the pathways for other folks to continue in that legacy. And it's important for us to understand our movement was built, and the foundation of our movement goes back to this history. Another story can be seen in the middle of your screen. This is actually a book called Celia, a Slave. And this is named this way because Celia Slave was named in court records because she was a young enslaved woman who experienced, a young enslaved Black woman who experienced sexual violence, domestic violence, assault, and extreme violence from the white slave owner. And she fought back and she killed that white slave owner. And the US government then prosecuted her. Unfortunately, and unsurprisingly at the time, she was found guilty. However, I think it's important for us again to contextualize this and think about, how did Celia create a pathway for survivors who resist to fight back and to say, hey, I was defending myself. There's a number of people, a number of cases that I think may come to mind of folks who fought back in the last number of years. It's something that's been happening throughout our history, and then are criminalized and then are retaliated against by the government, by the legal system. And again, it's important to recognize that Celia's fight is what allows us to fight these things today.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'll say is, or what I'll end with, is just reading this quote on the left, which we can get a little bit further into how Black communities were instrumental in creating our organizations through women's clubs that then, because of exclusionary behavior, created Black women's clubs when white women pushed Black women out of those, and how that organizing created a lot of our organizations. And eventually we arrive at this point, which is quoted from the Feminist Wire, that says the 1960s and 70s are central to historic understanding of US anti-rape activism, particularly in its institutional formations. The anti-violence work of these decades was deeply informed by Indigenous and Black women's activism against white supremacist sexual coercion and exploitation that extends back into US settler colonialism and slavery.
Yeah, well said, Darren. I think the piece that I just want to really highlight is that oftentimes in this movement, these stories get erased. And that is by design. We want to really name that in this moment, because currently, as we are seeing in these United States of America, there is even a specific fight against Black history being taught in schools. And I'm sure for many folks, this might be the first time you're hearing about the story of Celia, but this movement really stands on her shoulders. And it has been said, even through many Black historians in particular, because of what Celia went through, it also birthed a level of resistance that we even see in Harriet Tubman's story, and in her quest to also interrupt the conditions of oppression. So I just want to name that in this moment, and also just name that we actually have a lot of content we do want to get through today. So we're going to do our best in being able to share that out with y'all. And yeah, let's move on to the next slide, Darren. So it's important to note that there was a role in particular that white women played during slavery. We often, when we think of the period of enslavement, we have been taught, again, by design, that it was very masculinized during that period of enslavement, that it was just really the Ku Klux Klan going around causing havoc. Now, that is very true, but also there's a caveat here that I'd like to read out. I know that the text may be actually quite difficult for folks to read, but I'll do so in this moment. And I want us to be really leaning into what this author says. The author is Charles Blow, and the book is titled The Devil You Know. And this was published in 2021. And this excerpt from his book reads, "White women have known from the beginning in this country that they possess this power, the power to activate white supremacy and to spur it in extreme violence. They merely have to feign victimhood, to appear afraid, affronted, to muster a tear or a scream. The activation of white terror is a white woman's soft power. We like to masculinize white supremacy, to presume that it reeks of testosterone, when in fact, it is just likely to be spritzed by perfume. So history recalls in particular that 40% of slave owners were white women. It was white women who made the market for Black women's breast milk, who were attended by Black women in the big house. It was white women who upheld much of the day-to-day white supremacy, the school teachers, the store clerks, the waitresses, and now it is often white women attending police interactions with Black people. Now, I don't know about everybody else, but I will speak to the fact that when I was learning history or being taught history, this piece of white women literally being slave owners, 40%, was not something that was taught to me. I learned this much later in my life. And again, I really truly believe that many of these things are by design. And I really want to name, as someone has also just named in the chat, that this very much does sound like the story of Emmett Till. And that story continues to take course in our day-to-day lives as we see particularly how police interactions often have shown up because a white woman has feigned victimhood. And a similar or just a more recent interaction is with a young African immigrant boy who had his bike in New York, and a white woman wanted specifically his bike. And that interaction has basically led to this young Black boy being villainized and just existing because of his Blackness. And this white woman who could have had any other bike on the rack, but specifically chose his. I name this because oftentimes we don't think about how this actually appears in this work that we do, where we see that a white woman can say or name a thing and she will be believed just like that. But that is not necessarily the case of survivors who are Indigenous, who are Black, who are brown. And I really want us to really think critically about what it will take for us to collectively show up into this movement as accomplices. There will be, or there has to be, a level of unlearning as well, because as history points out to, that this United States of America has always, always favored and always held room in particular for white women. So I just want to name that in this moment.
Yeah, and I really just want to emphasize that piece where this is by design. And this history not being acknowledged, not being shared, and us not being as aware of it as we should is what allows these things to happen in our communities, to happen to that young man that was renting a bike, to happen in our organizations when folks, particularly white women, feign victimhood, appear afraid, and utilize these dynamics to target Black, brown, and Indigenous folks in this movement. So it's important to make that connection that this history, us being aware of it, is a protective factor, is something that will protect folks in our organization from being victimized. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that this intersectional approach to violence, where we understand that white women can inflict gender-based violence against Black communities, where we understand the intersections of how these things work, has been offered by civil rights icons and Black thought leaders for centuries. This is an excerpt from the Special Plight and the Role of Black Women speech given by Fannie Lou Hamer at NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1971. And she talks about the oppression of white women and how white women are leveraged against Black people. She says, her freedom, referring to white women, is shackled in chains to mine. And she realizes for the first time that she is not free until I am free. The point about it, the male influence in this country, you know, the white male, he didn't go and brainwash the Black man and the Black woman. He brainwashed his wife too. He made her think that she was an angel. You know, the reason I can say it, folks, I've been watching, and there's a lot of people been watching. And so Fannie Lou Hamer here is talking about how particularly white women have been leveraged in many cases throughout our society and throughout our history to perpetuate patriarchy. And so if we don't have this analysis, then we see these systems being replicated. And it's, again, important to recognize this, that as a Black man, I can perpetuate anti-Black patterns and structures and ideas in our society. As a white woman, you can perpetuate patriarchal ideas, patterns in our society. And I think oftentimes in this movement, we have not held that complexity. And again, it's important to not think about this as if it's a new thing, like, oh, intersectionality, while the naming of that concept is an incredibly, incredibly important moment, folks were talking about this concept in other ways in history, and it's important for us to be aware of that and to continue to revisit that.
Thank you for naming that, Darren. And it's important to also note that all of these also tie into patterns and systems that are still very much present within our movement. So when we think in particular of the period of enslavement in these United States of America between 1525 and 1866, in the entire history of the slave trade to the New World, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. It's been said that 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage. This is a quote by Henry Louis Gates Jr. I also just want to share this other caveat that this is what historians believe in at least their collection of data. There is still a very big possibility that there were even more Africans who were forcibly taken from the continent of Africa and brought to the Americas or the different parts of the world. I also want to name that this actually also speaks to the origins of inequitable labor, because when an enslaved person was brought to the Americas, one of the first things was they were renamed and branded. And then they were expected to work between 13 to 15-hour day shifts all the way until Sunday was their only day of rest. I want to name how this also shows up in our work, because society by default often believes that Black folks are the caretakers of society for everybody, in particular for white women. That a Black person should be burdened, should be overworked, should show up very, very equipped with every single resource tool that in the spur of a moment, if they're asked, they need to basically perform and do all of these things. But that is not an expectation of white folks. A white person can show up in a workplace and say, oh, I've only been doing this work for maybe the last 9 months or the last couple of years. So this is not something that I'm really well versed in. I'm just kind of following the handbook of this institution. And people will applaud that because they will say that white person actually has boundaries. But if a Black person echoes the same thing, oftentimes they're met with, oh, they're lazy. Oh, they're not really qualified. How did they even get to this job? Who allowed them to be in this space? There are all these other barriers. There are all these other forms of resistance that show up in such a violent way for a Black person to exist as their whole selves. I'm not talking about their code switching selves. I'm talking about as their whole selves. And the reason that exists in this day and age, or has always existed in this country, is we have to also name the fact that this country has been okay with anti-Black violence. whether it was during the period of enslavement, whether it was the period of Jim Crow, whether it was the period of civil rights, whether it was even the period of when Trayvon Martin was murdered to when George Floyd was murdered. This country has always enjoyed the benefit of this inequitable form of labor and anti-Black violence. So it's important for us, as we are thinking of the trajectory of this movement and what history will say about this time, examine in your own organization how Black people in particular are expected to show up. I name this because if an organization experiences some form of anti-Black violence, by default, everybody will be looking at the Black person to try to interpret, to try to name what has taken place, instead of the folks who are not efficient in understanding this and naming that actually we hired XYZ person to do these other tasks. And if we are asking them to show up and bring another part of an equitable lens into this room, maybe we need to really think about what compensation looks like. Maybe we actually need to examine the fact that because of anti-Black violence, generational wealth is not something that is widely afforded to Black people in this country. And so when we're thinking about salary scales, when we're thinking about capacity, when we're thinking about folks who have to show up and name and do all this labor, oftentimes not being appreciated, there is an anti-Black tone, knowingly or unknowingly.
Thank you, Valeriana. And Valeriana and I know that this can feel really conceptual to folks to think about how inequitable labor, 200, 300 years ago translates into our organizations today. Valeriana and I often talk about the ways that historians have actually looked into plantations records and found that the business practices, quote unquote business practices that they practiced then are very present in our current businesses today. And many of the practices that we utilize today are derived from this period, whether that's actual practices in terms of how we manage finances, manage labor, et cetera, or the more cultural pieces. For example, this common divide of management who sort of oversee workers and ensure and sort of have this assumption that workers don't want to work. And so our goal is to keep them in line and make sure that they're working. That sort of cultural understanding and practice can be derived from this point. And so we don't have time to jump into it too much today, but we often engage with the work of Dr. Caitlin Rosenthal and Dr. Matthew Desmond, who has been featured in the 1619 Project, who have made these connections. And our nonprofits have replicated many of these practices as well. And so it's something to really think critically about and to think about doing an audit, think about doing a process to really ensure that we're not replicating these things in our work to end violence.
And it's important to note with what Darren also shared, is when we are thinking historically about folks who showed up on the scene with little to no resources and the contributions that they made to society, we want to lean back to our ancestors in this moment and name the work of Madam C.J. Walker. Madam C.J. Walker, for folks who do not know, was actually born on a plantation. She was born into extreme poverty. Her parents were enslaved, and she used to actually be a domestic worker. Over a period of time, she basically discovered a recipe of how to particularly help with the growth of Black folks' hair. And as a result of it, her business ended up picking up and she ended up becoming a millionaire during the period of Jim Crow. It's important to note that even with the wealth that Madam C.J. Walker had, she started putting or reinvesting her Black dollars back into Black communities to contribute to schools so that Black children could be educated and to provide entrepreneurial avenues for Black folks at a period of time when enslavement, Jim Crow, all of those pieces was still very much alive and well. And in many respects, as we know of the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., much of his work was also around the concept of mutual aid, where folks basically shared their own resources amongst each other, where community giving was a way of life, a way of living. And as well as weaving into that practice of interrupting financial or economic oppression. Many folks actually name the fact that as he was deepening his understanding of interrupting economic oppression on a broader scale, that is when he was specifically assassinated. The Black Panther Party movement, many of us were taught in history that they were really a bunch of troublemakers. Many of us were told that. But one thing I want to name about the contributions that the Black Panther Party movement did, in particular for Black folks, was actually care work. Were these breakfast programs where Black children who basically their families were living on government assistance had these free breakfasts every morning, and they were given an education. What most folks don't know also is that for the advancement of sickle cell anemia on the medical scale of things, because sickle cell anemia in particular impacts Black communities globally. It was the work of the Black Panther Party movement that actually put a spotlight on that work. They were asked, in particular by a particular Asian government to come to their country, visit and learn about specific practices. It was when they brought it back to these United States of America where they were asked to appear on a nightly show. And that's when the entire country started talking about sickle cell anemia. This is not something that, again, has been taught in our history books. It's something that you have to learn just on your own mere research. And the one thing also that I want to highlight about the Black Panther Party movement is they were centering a form of food security at a time when there were many folks who were going without food, and protecting Black communities at a time when anti-Blackness was experiencing its all-time high in these United States of America. Now, while all of them had maybe differing frameworks, one thing I just want to highlight is the reason why their work to this day that we're really drawing into this space is that they saw the way oppression was showing up in the times that they're living in. And they thought, with the resources that we have, let's mobilize. Let's think creatively of how we can be diligent in interrupting either, whether it be white supremacy or whether it be forms of oppression, food insecurity, so that they could provide a level of care. I name this because many of us get into this work because there is a story, or maybe personally, we've been impacted by violence. And when we think about this work really is soul work. It's care work. And for us to continuously sustain that work, we must be drawing from the work of our ancestors, from folks who came way before our time, who probably barely had the resources that we have. And so when we're talking about what history will say of this time, history will also speak of the care that we showed up with when somebody named that they were experiencing anti-Black violence or oppression, and how we showed up, how we rendered aid. And so what this also speaks to is a quest and a call for the audacity of safety, in particular for Black women, because this care work has been historical. And oftentimes why these factors exist where Black women in particular, or Black trans women in particular, are expected to be everybody's caretaker is because there's been this notion for quite some time that Black folks have a higher pain tolerance. It wasn't that long ago when the American Medical Association had to basically recant some wording, I want to say it was actually in 2020, that actually named that when Black patients come in and they are needing to be cared for, basically, please note that they have a higher pain tolerance. This is in our medical books. And this actually speaks to the amount of times that Black folks have been in need of care, have been in need of help, and have not necessarily received that help because there has been this notion that you're strong, so you can handle that. This idea that we are pillars of strength for everyone does not create a container for people to also realize that we are human, that we need to be cared for as well. We are often targets of fetishization and for folks who tokenize us, whether it be in the workplace. And I also just want to name that this experience is not just isolated with Black folks. This also happens to Indigenous folks and to Brown folks. And oftentimes, when an organization does an audit, that is also when people actually start to realize that Black folks, Brown folks, Indigenous folks are oftentimes recipients of financial oppression. Now, Malcolm X said this quote, and I'm going to read this out loud, just in case there are folks who may not be able to see this so well on the screen. And this quote says, "The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. The most underprotected person in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is the Black woman." I know that we don't have to even look far when we particularly think of how Amber Alerts have not been created to care for the missing Black girls and women. This is why many communities have had to really create their own types of collectives and coalitions to care for their own people, because society almost always will still default to centering and protecting white folks. Now, we do have a video here, but I know that for the sake of time, we might not be able to play it, but we will make it a point that this video is available. And this video really speaks to the US medical system and how it was built on basically the backs of Black women and girls. I really encourage folks that when you do get the link of this video, that you share this far and wide in your organization. I do want to give a trigger warning to folks, and in particular, just some of the history, some of the pieces that are named in this video. But I will say this, after seeing this video, history will have a lot to say about how you showed up in this work.
And I want to mention that I think oftentimes folks' reaction to this, for various reasons that we've sort of touched on, is to think about, oh, well, what about other communities? What about trans communities? What about disabled communities? What about Latinx communities? And I think it's important for us to name and acknowledge that Black women are in all of these communities that I just named. And when we look at how these communities are impacted by harm, we find consistently that Black trans women, Black disabled women, Black Latinx women tend to be the most impacted by harm and by oppression. And so that's why we're focusing on Black women. And that's why this is an inclusive lens for us to move forward with.
Now, the realities of anti-Black history in the nonprofit industry speaks to the fact that anti-Blackness wasn't just birthed on its own. There were conditions created for this anti-Blackness to thrive. I name this because the facts speak for themselves. 80% of all nonprofits are white-led. 315 of the largest nonprofits in these United States of America are 90% led by white folks. 80% of nonprofit recruitment often takes place from a professional network pool. We all understand what professionalism really still speaks to, which is really whiteness. 75% of white folks often do not even have Black, Indigenous, or Brown folks in their professional network. Now that speaks volumes, and in particular, it speaks volumes to the fact that if we are looking at disrupting and changing the trajectory of how folks can function in this community, or in our global community, I should say. It also means that we need to be we need to be creating containers, room specifically for Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks to be able to lead in their own right without being questioned. And without those conditions being made present, we often will still see that cycle. And the graphics in front of our screen speak to that. The graphic on the left shows how a white woman has been able to penetrate through a ceiling within an organization, and she's literally climbing a ladder. And the folks who are at the ceiling is a Black woman who is dressed in a purple dress, a Latinx woman who's dressed in a pink suit, and two brown folks, one in a green dress and one in a green suit. And they're feeling and they're noting that they have reached the ceiling of their work, but the white woman still is given considerations to climb beyond that ceiling. I want us to think critically about even the history of your own respective organization. When was the last time that your board makeup, when was the last time that your leadership makeup actually reflected the community that is most adversely impacted by gender-based violence? The picture on the right side of the screen shows a Black woman and two white folks behind her who are touching her curly Black hair. Oftentimes, that tokenization takes place in the workplace, and people often see it as the norm. And I want to, again, name that. Oftentimes, that is the norm because of the decision makers who are in the room who don't necessarily understand or know cultural context, in particular when dealing with Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. I want to name this because there is room to pivot. Instead of leaning into white guilt and feeling like, oh, maybe I really haven't done a thing. Today is an opportunity to actually shift course, to actually make room for the folks in the room that you know never really ever get a turn to lead, never really ever get a turn to truly be a decision maker and be respected as a decision maker. Because it is one thing for a white-led organization to recognize that they want to pivot, that they want to make changes. So they go out of their way to install a Black person, or in particular, Black women or Black woman to lead the organization. But the board makeup still is predominantly led by white folks who still want to be able to police, still want to be able to micromanage and make all the decisions that this person can make within the organization. Oftentimes, folks, when that shows up, it means colonization is in the room. It means at the end of the day, the currency of anti-Blackness is still the currency that that organization adheres to. And so it's important to note that if we are looking at disrupting all of these factors that we named, we also examine financial oppression. Because financial oppression will require us to be transparent. It will require organizations to do a deep dive into how salaries and wages and even monies that have been set aside for Black, Brown, and Indigenous contractors to do the work. And this particular slide, it really speaks to how there can actually be room to interrupt how financial oppression often shows up by providing open communication with staff members about what your budget looks like for your organization. Oftentimes, there are many organizations in this movement that exist. And if you ask staff members, if you ask particularly advocates or frontline workers, when was the last time you were given access to your organization's budget so that you are able to also be part of the collective decision-making processes? Many folks may actually say, we were not given access to that's only a management role, and that creates elitism. That also signs off and adheres to colonialization. There's also room for there to be reviews of livable wages that champion equity. When was the last time that discussion came up in your organization? I say this in particular because we know for a fact that there are probably decision makers who are in this room. I hope that these are questions that you can actually sit with yourself, that you can take note of and take it back into your organization. Or consider even doing a survey that asks staff about what their needs might actually look like. Oftentimes there's this expectation that you are hired for this job, so you need to commit to fulfilling specific deliverables, and the organization just kind of pays you what they can. But oftentimes we see the disparity of what an executive director will make and what an advocate will make. And the disparity is far and wide, very, very large. And if possible, even revisiting job descriptions to ensure that if someone has taken on extra tasks, they're financially compensated for that. If we're specifically always looking to the Black woman in the room to speak to interrupting the anti-Blackness, is she paid for that as well? And the other piece is educating all staff, ensuring that political learnings are a part of the day-to-day operations of the organization. And I'm not just talking about the preventionists in the room, the middle managers. Bring in the financial directors, bring in your accountants into this discussion, because oftentimes financial oppression does show up because accountants have not necessarily been included into these conversations. And there is room that when an accountant is included into these conversations about interrupting financial oppression, that the agency can actually be thinking far and wide about ways in which they can interrupt barriers.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you mentioned in the last slide that I'd like to expand on, Valeriana, is this idea that oftentimes we come to learn this information about some of the problematic practices that are in place in our organizations that perhaps we have invested in, that we have led on, that we have implemented. And a significant barrier in addressing those is a reaction of guilt. And I want to reframe that for folks, because it's really common for folks to again, get this information and struggle with the idea that they've been perpetuating this harm, sometimes for decades. And that can be a real barrier in making the change. And again, I think it's important that we reframe this with something that I used to tell young men when we were doing groups on masculinity in California through the My Strength program about 15 years ago, which is guilt and responsibility are two very, very similar ideas. And it's a choice for us to turn towards guilt, which is very much an internal, selfish way of moving, versus turning towards responsibility. So if you see yourself, if you see your organization in some of these problematic practices, I just want to encourage you to be thoughtful about how are you potentially perpetuating this sort of pattern of clinging towards guilt, which often doesn't bring about any movement, often brings out defensiveness, often brings out separation and distancing. And how can we transition that and be intentional about the fact that as we recognize that we have done harm, that should spur us to hold some responsibility for being accountable for that, some responsibility for changing these things.
And naturally, this conversation leads me to speak about the oppression pyramid or anti-Blackness pyramid that I created in 2019 at a time when I couldn't find any illustrations that outlined how the suppression shows up, particularly in nonprofit spaces, but this can be applied to any other space. But before I get into that, of that illustration that's seen on the far left, which is the triangle or the pyramid that's in red, I want us to think critically about the illustration that we see on our right side. And this illustration was done by a particular network, the CocoNet Network and Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence. And this illustration is titled The Problem, or the Problem, Women of Color in the Workplace. And this illustration shows in particular that when women of color a Black, Brown, or Indigenous person enters the organization, in particular, like, let's just think of an organization that historically has been white-led. So this person is brought into the organization, and immediately white leadership makes sure that this particular person experiences the honeymoon phase. So they are welcomed, they are needed. There's so much joy in this phase. People are saying welcome. Some people are even saying welcome to the movement. That's another story for another day. But anyway, this person is tokenized. This is that period of actually being tokenized, because this organization will go on overdrive to make sure that this person's image is seen on the website, that there is a sharing on social media posts. And it's really to create this illusion that, like, we're not racist. We're specifically not racist. Look, we hired a Black person. But the reality is, when this Black, Brown, or Indigenous person points out issues within the organization, when they name that the structures and policies actually are not equitable, and they're actually pushing for accountability, this is that period where there is repetitive injury, where there are actually macro aggressions. I don't want to say micro, because aggressions in particular live and breathe within someone's body, and they have to probably go speak to their partner, to their therapist, to somebody they trust in the community, because of the harm that they're experiencing. And that oftentimes can even shape their entire professional experience or career. And so this person is now seen as the problem. And the organization's response is to deny, ignore, shift blame, and place it particularly on this Black, Brown, or Indigenous person. And so this person is attacked, targeted, and retaliatory efforts are made so that this Black, Brown, or Indigenous person is erased from the organization. And I am almost positive that probably most of you have read or are still reading the Mother Jones article. And as you can see, this depiction is a lived experience of something that I lived and breathed when I worked at the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. When I brought up, in particular, instances of policies needing to be changed, naming how anti-Blackness was the currency in the room. When I brought those things to light, I was now seen as the problem. But I just want to note that the only distinction between my story and a sea of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks is that my story was told publicly. Now, it makes me wonder how many folks lived and breathed an experience of erasure in this movement that we do not even know about, because their stories were swept neatly underneath a carpet, and the organization continued as business as usual. And so this leads me go back to the graphic on the left side, which speaks to the oppression and anti-violence pyramid that I created in 2019. At the time, Darren and I were working at the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, and we were noticing how anti-Blackness was still the currency in the room. We were noticing that every time we thought about Black victims, Black survivors, we were met with many, many excuses. We were basically told to really center white victims and survivors. And so when I created this illustration, I was thinking about all of the instances in which, when anti-Blackness is not, or oppression is not interrupted, it almost always escalates. So on the pyramid, the bottom layer is dehumanization. Dehumanization speaks to this notion that white folks may feel, think, or historically have leaned into the lens that Black folks are 3/5 of a person. It wasn't that long ago when this history or this reality was a way of living in these United States of America, and we're still seeing that. Dehumanization speaks to really not feeling like someone is truly human, that this person in particular, on the scale of their needs should be deprioritized, because at the end of the day, their concerns don't really impact all the folks in the room, and particularly the folks in the room who are white. The next level on this pyramid speaks to disbelief and skepticism. This speaks to the layer or the reality of when a person who's already been dehumanized is naming, hey, I'm having this reality, and I really, really want to know if folks will advocate, if folks will be thinking critically or carefully about my lived experience, in particular, the macro or microaggressions that someone is experiencing on the day-to-day in an organization. This can show up when a Black, Brown, or an Indigenous person is speaking, and somebody wants to just immediately interrupt or speak over them. In a meeting, it can be in a setting, or even this notion of when somebody is doing work with a Black, Brown, or Indigenous person, when they're sending an email as a form to police them, they will make sure they CC the entire management on that email, just to let that person know they're being watched. That means that disbelief and skepticism is already in the room. Now, the next level that often shows up after that, when that's not interrupted, is comparison and colorism. Now, this is the notion and the belief that somebody who is not white adjacent, somebody who is darker skinned in particular, falls into the category of someone that shouldn't be believed, or this idea that what we will do is pit one community against another community. This is the narrative or the idea that, oh, look, this brown population, when they show up in the workplace, they don't complain. They're kind about all how they navigate situations. And when we look at Black folks, they're being too loud. They're complaining way too much, or they have an attitude. Those narratives in particular speak to the fact that white folks in the room have already made a decision. And that decision is to adhere to center folks who are specifically either white passing, who specifically do not necessarily share out loud about how it's important to interrupt anti-Blackness. It's important to note that when that instance of harm is taking place, exclusionary behavior is almost always met right after that. Now, that exclusionary behavior can be like that person who shared concerns and who particularly is naming, hey, our policies in our organization are actually quite white supremacist. Could we make some adjustments? So instead of the organization believing this particular person's experiences and specifically lived experiences, they're excluded out of meetings. They're the last one to be told when policies are being changed. Information sharing isn't really the norm to come in the direction for this person. And then also oftentimes what we see is the gatekeeping culture is showing up at that time. That means management is really having a resistance against this person. And oftentimes when this shows up, this is also a sign that erasure is right around the corner. Now, when that is not interrupted, what takes place is public lynching. Now, we know historically, public lynchings often took place as a sport for white folks. White folks would come and literally watch Black folks being violently harmed, and I shouldn't even say harmed, murdered, and strung up on a tree, and people would watch. Now, public lynching has taken on another form in this day and age. And oftentimes how it shows up is in silent or quiet allyship. When someone knows in particular, these things that are taking place in this organization are very white supremacist. And instead of in real time interrupting that oppression, what they specifically do is say it privately to the Black, the Brown, the Indigenous person, but publicly remain silent. So all the white folks who said, I stand with Black folks, all the white folks that said, I want to march or they actively marched when George Floyd was murdered. Here we are in 2023, where we have found that many of those promises have now shifted course. Many organizations have sunsetted away from really centering a racial equity lens. That's a form of public lynching, allowing and very much signing off in particular for Black folks to experience harm in real time, and no one is interrupting it. Now, what takes place immediately after that is death. It can be the death of a career, death of an opportunity, physical death, and death in many forms that actually impact this person's livelihood. And I can guarantee that Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, Orlando Castile, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all experienced all of these different forms of anti-Blackness just before death took place. And it's important to note that that type of death that took place with all of those instances of anti-Black oppression, they can also actually happen in one instance, where dehumanization, disbelief, colorism, exclusionary behavior, public lynching, and death happen all in one moment. Darren, I wonder if you have something that you'd like to add to this.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you so much for so thoroughly going through this, Valeriana. I think the piece that I always really like to emphasize is the public lynching, because it's very, very real. And I think folks might have a reaction to that, oh, wasn't that maybe an exaggerated comparison or something? But I think what people need to recognize is the ways that public lynching was used in our society to make an example out of Black people and say, hey, if you step out of line, this is what's going to happen to you. To make an example to white people and empower folks and say, hey, here's a reminder that this is the power that you have. And particularly in the situation that we experienced that's covered in the Mother Jones article, that was a very, very real thing that happened. And a significant or essential part of a public lynching is that there is no trial, there is no fair process for the person to be heard and to understand what happened. And that's something that happened particularly to Valeriana, is that her co-director, Michelle Dixon Wall, who is named in the article, which is why I'm using her name, she made a false grievance, and they ran with that grievance and didn't ask questions, even though there was no evidence. And several people in the organization could have provided evidence to the contrary, that the basis of that false grievance was false, that those events didn't happen. But there is no fair process here. And in this situation, myself and Valeriana, as is made clear in this Woman of Color in the Workplace graphic here, we're raising issues about how we were being treated and the anti-Blackness that we were experiencing in the organization. And those largely went ignored, dismissed, downplayed, and not taken seriously and disbelieved. And when a false grievance was weaponized against Valeriana, in particular by a white woman who, thinking back to that slide about how the white woman can defer to tears, can defer to a scream and be protected. That person then again puts in a false grievance, and the organization gets shut down for a period of time. An investigation that we still have never seen the conclusion of gets initiated, and Valeriana is then wrongfully terminated by the organization. And so this is something that happens very, very often. And I encourage folks to think about where they've seen these dynamics play out in their organizations, in their communities, because it's something that happens very, very common, very often. And so I just really want to emphasize that that is real. It is not an exaggeration. And I also want to emphasize the death piece, because it is very possible that when people are wrongfully terminated, are pushed out of workplaces, that impacts their livelihood, that impacts their ability to care for their families, that impacts their mental health, that impacts their physical health and their spiritual health, and so many different aspects of someone's life, that it can have very grave consequences. And it's something that Valeriana and I have talked about quite a bit, is that we can see where, I think we had some resources, and I think had, some spirit, we had each other, we had some things that allowed us to get through this, but we can see where it could have gone in a different direction, where we could have been homeless, where this could have affected our mental health in more severe ways. So really just want to emphasize that this is real, this is concrete, and these are the lived experiences of marginalized people in our movement, in particular Black women, in particular Black communities. However, these dynamics are often weaponized to maintain the status quo, to maintain the leadership of certain communities at the expense of others in this movement.
And to your point, Darren, before we actually skip this or move to the next slide, we did just get a prompt that there are, I believe, 2 questions. And I know that oftentimes when we talk about this pyramid or we talk about this particular illustration, folks have questions to follow up. So I wonder, Casey, if you'd like to share out those questions for folks.
Yes, thank you so much for this powerful presentation. The first question we received from an attendee is, how do we encourage accepting responsibility in contributing to white supremacy instead of passing the buck? I often hear from managers that they want to make systemic changes to support Black employees, but the ED won't go for it, or that the ED wants changes, but the board won't go for it. But that isn't full accountability either. We don't want surface changes. We want you individually as a leader to acknowledge how your leadership and practices contribute to white supremacy. How do we make that a more clear and tangible ask of organizational leaders?
That's a really, really great question. I imagine we both have thoughts on that one. I think the thing that I would lead with would be real concrete accountability. It's often built into our organizations that marginalized people can be held accountable in a number of different ways. And often when we see these efforts to interrupt anti-Blackness, to make a more equitable workplace, what often gets missed is accountability mechanisms, ways for us to ensure that this is happening and that it's having a real impact in the organization and the organization's work. I was recently working with some folks where a white woman was talking about the harm that she did and continued to do. And she was saying that, like, I am trying so hard. I am reading all these books. I'm trying so hard to be anti-racist, but I keep making mistakes and I keep harming people. And I'm not trying to do it, but I'm trying, but I just keep making these mistakes. And my response was, as a Black man in this movement, I am someone who is a cisgender man who's socialized as a masculine person, and so am sort of primed to be involved in sexism. I can't make mistakes in the same way that white woman can make mistakes. So what I told her was that accountability is this piece here, in that if you were potentially held accountable and experienced consequences as a result of these mistakes, which I put in quotes because that was her language and that's not what I would use to describe these aggressions and the harm that she was talking about. But that systematically in our organizations, leadership often does not face consequences for failing to uphold equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. And so it's really, really important to build that into the process. And there's a number of different ways to do that, whether that be, I think, primarily working with folks who have expertise in that, whether it be being transparent about your efforts and making it clear what you're doing, what your goals are, so that people in your community can hold you accountable and say, hey, 3 years later, you still don't have any Black staff. Like, what are you said 3 years ago that this is something that you're working towards. So what are the consequences? What needs to change in order for us to work towards that? So I think that's the sort of number one thing that I would say in response to that is building in accountability and some consequence when we don't achieve equity and move towards a more equitable workplace, a more inclusive workplace is a really, really important step that often intentionally gets missed.
Yeah, I think, and another piece I just want to add to your point, Darren, is this also speaks of organizations re-examining their values and asking the question, what is our North Star? Because if your board, if your executive director or directors cannot live and breathe those values, or even therefore the value, or maybe previous values you've held, it also speaks to who your organization is comfortable with being in proximity to. And it's important to note that specifically white folks, y'all hold a level of privilege and power in ways where as staff, you can organize. You can actually sit down and have those tangible conversations with folks who are in leadership, folks who look like you, and name that your North Star is amiss. Even that simple prompt can actually open the floodgates of many possibilities. I also name this because Darren and I, to this day, since the time of 2020, when all of those awful things happened to us at the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, we recognize that we've made it our life's work to actually spend a considerable amount of our work to center these efforts. And I say this because there are organizations that at times will contract us out, will ask us, can you do XYZ workshop? And then they start realizing, wait, in this workshop, we're even recognizing we even have a bigger problem. We need to do an audit. Okay, we need a report. Well, those things are all well and good, but the question is, what happens after the contractors leave that organization? What happens when the contract is done? Is your organization collectively committed to interrupting oppression, to ensuring that an anti-oppressive lens is the currency in the room? Because when we think of things like even board recruitment, oftentimes there's just a prompt on a website that's like, hey, do you want to join our board? There isn't even room for the organization or thought processes for the staff to actually be the folks who are sitting together and saying, hey, this is who we want to attract on our board. We want people who are on the ground, people who have had a lived experiences of interrupting oppression, who have been doing this work for so long, and maybe they don't have a name that is considered a name of notoriety, but they've been tirelessly doing that work. I name this because sometimes in this movement, it stuns me at times when I see that there are white folks who feel that maybe they're helpless, that there's nothing that they can exactly do when they have a white ED who's being oppressive. But yet what I would say is lean into that privilege. Chances are the Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks in your organization have actually probably tried efforts to interrupt that type of oppression, but they've not gotten anywhere. Or maybe there's a fear of what will their livelihoods look like after, because there've been instances upon instances of maybe a director ensuring that this person can't work within an entire movement. I say that because when I had my instance of anti-Black oppression at WICSAP, that was the narrative, to silence me so that I could never tell my story, so that I could never do this work, and even in the state of Washington. And I'm thankful because I had white co-conspirators in my life who actively did not allow for that to happen. They made it a point, they made it their life's mission during that period of time, and even to date, to show up in such an audacious way. I say this because history will say a lot of what we are doing with this time. We leaned into what Dr. King has done, the Black Panther Party movement, Madam C.J. Walker. And these are folks that lived in a time when it wasn't like power was given over to them. They had to show up at a time when society did not even love them. I see that maybe another hand might be raised.
Yes, in fact, we're trying to communicate with Nicole about her hand and if she has a question that she wants to pose. But I do have another question from a participant, and I really appreciate those responses. I'm taking away from it as a white woman, you know, the necessity around having those hard conversations with white leaders. And sometimes those conversations are around when it's time to go. So I'm taking that with me. So Kathleen McCoy Parson is saying that she loves the idea of a needs assessment and is wondering if you have any samples that you can share that you may have used or could be used by organizations. I will say too that behind the scenes, our TA team is working on collecting those to share out as well, but wondered if you had any recommendations around the needs assessment process.
Yeah, actually, I actively was engaged in a needs assessment process when I was at WICSAP. So one thing I will say, because for the sake of time, Kathleen, I will make sure that my email is provided, and I know Darren will also provide his email. Feel free to reach out to us, because that's going to segue into us probably having more chatter in a direction where, for the time that we have limited, we really can't get into the crux of it, but we want to make sure that we honor that request. And yeah, we'll have conversations there. And I just want to name that also for anyone that is noting in particular, that maybe there's some material here that you're like, oh, I have more questions, our organization needs this support. Feel free to send us emails. We would be glad to speak to y'all and to your organizations about ways that we could potentially even do some work to support y'all.
So I don't know if you have time for more questions, or if I know that you have a lot you want to cover. So what we can do is offer to folks that we can collect questions and follow up afterwards. It's your call as our facilitators. I'm
open to both, but Darren, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking that makes a lot of sense. We've got a few more slides to go in about 15 minutes or so here. So I think we should jump back into the content, and yeah, just encourage folks to connect with NRCDB to have those questions answered, or to contact us directly, and we can answer those at a later time.
Thank you.
So I want to pivot a bit into discussing the socioecological model. And this is a model that I'm sure a lot of folks here are familiar with, in particular folks who do prevention work, because this has been utilized in this movement, in particular by the CDC, to help us understand how gender-based violence happens at these various levels and how they interact with each other. I think it's important to note that this is not a linear model. So it's not saying that, you know, something happens at the individual level and then it moves to relationship, then it moves to community. It happens in all different ways. As individuals, we gather social and cultural norms from the societal level. Within our relationships, those are driven by our individual experiences, our own individual histories and attitudes and beliefs. And our communities, such as our workplaces, are often driven by the same things, driven by our relationships, driven by our individual attitudes and beliefs. But I bring this up because something that Valeriana and I often do when we're working with organizations in this movement is to talk about the ways that we can use our current frameworks that we understand when it comes to gender-based violence and apply those to racial violence to better understand how that happens and how we need to respond to it. And so I encourage folks to think about, in particular, that example of the quote unquote problem, woman of color in the workplace in that flow chart. How does that get fueled by the socio-ecological model? How does that happen in that workplace in a way that relates to individual attitudes and beliefs? So, for example, when the Black woman or the woman of color is not believed when she raises issues or when she tries to hold folks accountable, how does that relate to our individual attitudes and beliefs? How does that relate to our relationships in the workplace and the fact that, hey, maybe there are people who have friendships with the person who's engaging in harm, and maybe it's really hard for them to hold their friend accountable in the workplace when they've got plans to, go hang out with each other's family over the weekend. How are our workplace policies contributing to the situation and creating potential risks? And how are our societal norms and cultural norms fueling the situation? And how can we make intentional efforts in our organizations to recognize these social and cultural norms that contribute to racism, that contribute to harm, and buffer against them? So again, really encourage folks to lean into the frameworks that we already understand and think about how can we apply this outside of gender-based violence in a more intersectional way. Another model that we often use is the power and control wheel. That power and control wheel is incredibly useful for thinking about the various ways that violence happens and that power and control is asserted over various communities, including talking about racism. So there's the economic violence, there's various patterns that are named on that power and control wheel that we can sort of categorize to understand the pervasiveness of racism in our society, in our workplaces, and in various settings. And one thing that I really want to emphasize is that these things are not new. We often talk about our work as if we're, tech companies, that we're inventing new things, inventing new frameworks so that we can better prevent violence. And so we sort of adopt the latest and greatest, and we're like, okay, this is it. This is the new thing that we need to put in place. And when we do this, we're going to have prevented violence. But that's not how this works. And again, we can lean on history and we can learn from history to better understand how these things happen instead of just defaulting to creating new models, naming new concepts. And again, as we've talked about, a lot of times this history is specifically sort of pushed to the margins and hard to access. Not too many folks know who Kwame Ture is, or Charles V. Hamilton, who wrote Black Power, The Politics of Liberation. But that book can inform our movement in so many different ways. And so it's really important for us to make these connections, to look back in history. And this is a quote from that book on the right here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it shows that in this book, they talk about individual acts of racism and institutional racism and how they relate and the impacts of them. And they talk about the ways that racism can be subtle and can happen in ways that are not the overt acts that we often assume they are. And this underlying portion here says the second type of racism is less overt, far more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts. But it is no less destructive of human life. The second type originates in the operation of established and respected forces in the society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than the first type. We can access and lean on this history, lean on these historical analysis of harm and oppression in our society, again, to better inform our work today. So I just really encourage folks to lean into that.
Thank you, Darren.
Now, one thing, we don't have a ton of time, so I'll move pretty quickly here, but this is a really, really important thing for us to cover because it's a pattern that happens so often. And that's the pattern of DARVO, which is a term that was coined by Jennifer Fry, who is a researcher in Oregon, who talks about the ways that that survivors are retaliated against when they seek justice. And what DARVO stands for is deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. And again, we can go back to that quote unquote problem, woman of color in the workplace model, and see how this is happening. That organization is denying that these things are happening. And then they start attacking that person and saying, hey, the way that you're raising these things isn't very professional, or hey, you showed up late yesterday. That's the real problem. So we're going to focus on that. There are so many ways that people end up sort of denying and reframing the situation so that they don't have to be accountable for the harm that they did. And instead, they're reversing these roles and saying, actually, you're the one who's doing harm here. And we saw this in such a public way with Johnny Depp, and the way that after he committed domestic violence, and after the survivor of that domestic violence, who's for some reason her name is escaping me, Valeriana, do you have that on hand?
I believe her name was, I want to say Amber. I could be wrong.
Amber Heard, yes, I apologize for that. But the way that when Amber Heard named that she experienced domestic violence, Johnny Depp then attacked her and reversed victim and offender, and did this in a way that the courts actually perpetuated and went along with. So that's one example that we've seen in this, but I think it's also something that we see in this narrative about cancel culture. And Colin Kaepernick is a prime example of this, in that he called out harm that was happening to Black communities, racism that was happening in the NFL, and he was very much attacked for that. And he was made out to be the problem, and him and another player actually won a lawsuit where they proved that they were retaliated against, that the NFL colluded to keep them out as a result of them raising issues about racial violence. And to this day, he still hasn't had an opportunity to join the NFL, and it is becoming more and more clear that that's very unlikely to happen. And so I want to bring this up because we often hear this idea of cancel culture, and it's often applied when marginalized communities raise issue about harm that's happening. And in particular, it then turns those communities that are trying to hold our society accountable into the offender. But it's really important for us to recognize that this operates very differently for various people. People with less power, often Black folks, are put into a position where they are actually canceled, they are actually pushed out of the organization, or they are, put in a position where they're pressured to sign an NDA and leave, and therefore their contributions are then very much silenced and very much hidden away. Whereas it's actually, if you look at where this is used, oftentimes the folks who we claim are being canceled are not. The ones who have a lot of power are not. Louis C.K., who committed sexual violence and was being held accountable for that, still does a lot of gigs, is still in movies, you know? And so it's really important for us to be critical about how this shows up and how it can be a barrier for us to achieve real accountability in the workplace.
Thank you for naming that, Darian. And so for the last 4 minutes that we have, I wonder if we can move to the next slide, but just really share a piece, I think, Darian, to the why for folks, because I know we're at time, but I know we'll be able to share some of this content out. And really an emphasis for folks who feel like, I came to this workshop, I've learned all these things. Why is it really important for me to be thinking about what history will say of me and my organization? I wonder what comes up for you, Darren, as we even look at this slide.
Yeah, I think it's something for us to, you know, there's an intentional effort behind that title for this workshop. And that's for us to not see our work, our roles in a vacuum, to see it in the context of history. And what white supremacy, what patriarchy, what professionalism does is, again, it sort of pushes us to perform and to hold our roles and our jobs over the importance of the actual work, the actual change, the relationships, the community. And so what we really want folks to lean into is understanding their role in this work as situated in a broader movement that includes all of this history that we've gone through, and for that to drive the work, because I think that is what drives us to be accountable in our organization. That is what drives us to make significant change. That's what drives us to take risks and say, hey, I'm witnessing racism in this organization, and for this movement, I need to call that out. It's so common that instead of that, our reaction is, I'm witnessing this racism, but if I call that out, that could impact my job. And so unfortunately, in this movement, we have often prioritized our own jobs, our own incomes, our own sort of resumes and accolades and whatnot over the broader movement and the goal of ending violence in our communities. So I just really want to encourage folks to lean into that broader context, which I think then primes us to interrupt these things and to recognize that, hey, if I'm retaliated against because I did the right thing in the broader movement, that is going to take us to the goal that we seek, which is to end violence in our communities. If I try to hold on to what I have over interrupting harm, then that in the long run is going to harm our movement. And so just really want folks to think about that context.
Thank you, Darren. And I think the last thing I want to just name is for folks who are wondering about the why, as we shared so early on, we came into this work mainly also because of the legacy of our ancestors. And in many respects, this work chose us. And so for us, this is really deeply soul work. And I know there is probably a sea of you who have stories upon stories upon stories of folks who came way before your time that added to the layer of why you're doing this work. And the biggest piece is there's a generation that's coming up right after us, and a generation after them, and a generation after them. And this period of time is a new type of civil rights chapter, whether people want to name it or not. It's a Renaissance period as well, where we have an opportunity to re-examine and realign ourselves with a North Star that really speaks to ending gender-based violence in a way where we can be way more equitable. And I name this because we have lost some people in this movement. Some people have died. People have been erased. People have been harmed so severely, they no longer want any parts of this movement. And if we call ourselves the anti-violence movement, we should not be the ones who are actively engaging in that violence. So I hope that folks will take away with them to really rethink, re-examine, what are our values? What really brought me into this work? Who inspired me to be here at this point of time? And what will history say about all of my actions? All of the things people can see, or the things that I'm even doing privately. And I name this because for this work to truly sustain itself, it needs us all to be co-conspirators. All right, I know we're at time, but I want to say thank you to every single one of you who've taken the time to be here with us. I know our email addresses have been provided. I'm sure there are questions, but the one request that Darren and I have now that we have concluded our time together today, for those who are still available on the screen, we would love to take a picture because we definitely want to share this largely, and we really hope that the words, the content, the examples we shared today really resonate and speak to all of y'all. Some of you are probably having a very, very, very real experience of interrupting oppression. I want you to know that we need you in this movement. And I really hope that you and your story will continuously to even live beyond the time that you're even in this work. So, Casey, I'm assuming the prompt for the picture, was that you or Kim that can make that happen?
Kim, and we're going to pass the floor to Marlena too. So should we, if everyone who's in this space can come off camera, I know the participants, I don't believe their cameras are enabled, but this team supporting the presentation, I think is a lovely group.
Yes, we're ready.
Okay, I can do a screenshot on.
I got it. Thank you.
Okay, you got it.
Thank you, y'all. Appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, if you have any follow-ups, if you think that we might be able to support you in this work, then again, really encourage you to reach out, and we want to help you. We want to support you. Thank you so much for taking your time and being here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Marlena?
All right, thank you all for coming in today. We just wanted to let you know that the contact information has been presented in the slide deck and also shared in the chat. And then also connect with us via the multiple forms of contact information on the screen right now. And then we're going to thank our funders for supporting, and yes, this presentation was made possible by this grant through the Administration on Children, Youth and Families, the Family Youth Service Bureau, and from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We also want to thank everyone who has supported us, including the interpreters and the captioners today. We know that we are still working on making sure that this space is as accessible as possible. So we appreciate you. And then I have also put a survey link into the chat. Please take that so we can understand exactly how you feel and other thoughts that you have about this presentation. Thank you all.